everyone. And it's wonderful to see so many of you here, though I'm not surprised at all, given both the intriguing title of the lecture and speaker that we have with us. So I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Stephan Kemperdick, who many of you will know very well. He's had a glittering career at the Gemäldegalerie in Berlin, where he's been in charge, of course, of the early Netherlandish and German painting since I think about 2007. In his tenure there, he's curated, of course, many really significant exhibitions, both actually in Berlin and elsewhere. Really tremendous Master of Flémalle and Rotterdam de Weyden in 2008. That was just mind-blowing. The Road to Van Eyck in Rotterdam, and not the Road to Van Eyck in Rotterdam. I mean, the Road to Van Eyck was in Rotterdam. Maybe Van Eyck's road was to Rotterdam, I don't know. In 2012. A truly wonderful small show around the Fouquet Melon diptych in 2017, and of course most recently, I know many of you have been to see it, the blockbuster, and it really was a blockbuster, Hugo van der Goes, that closed this summer. Stephan's scholarship is always, I think, inspiring, often intriguing, sometimes iconoclastic even. I think we'll maybe see this tonight. And it makes us question our assumptions and look afresh, I think, always, at old, often seemingly intractable problems in the field. He likes, I think, to take on the big guns, I think that's fair to say. The controversial works that have been at the centre of the study of early Netherlandish painting since its inception, since really the dawn of the discipline. Stephan is also a very long-time friend of the Curator, and he has generously shared his time and expertise on many visits staff and students have made to Berlin. He has provided us with exceptional access, often to his collections and the exhibitions he has curated. It's a delight to be able to host him here in London for a week, thanks to the support and generosity of Sam Fogg. Indeed, this event actually marks a welcome and an overdue return, because Stephan came to do not exactly the same thing, but a variation of this nearly a decade ago, which was part of a series we had then of visiting curators, which was supported by the Research Forum. And that was something that was a really memorable meeting of colleagues and students, and it was something that I'd always wanted to repeat. He spoke then on the Ghent Altarpiece, so if you think the big guns, the Ghent Altarpiece, now Arnolfini. And it was so memorable. I know we talked about it for years, that seminar that he gave, and many of you will have been there. So that visit sparked numerous conversations, friendships, collegial contacts that have been fruitful, I think, in ways that none of us really had foreseen, gone on through that decade. So I'm really grateful for Stephan for agreeing to come back and do this again, and to Sam Fogg, of course, for generously supporting it. Also to the Research Forum, the Curator Gallery, the National Gallery, and the British Museum, who are all involved in some way or another with events this week. Tonight, however, Stephan addresses both a larger audience and, as I say, this huge and controversial topic, the identity of the sitters of the Arnolfini portrait. Stephan, thank you.
Many thanks, Susie, for these kind words. And many thanks, Sam, for making it possible for me to come here. And I'm really tremendously looking forward to the next days and also this evening lecture. Well, what you can see, Arnolfini, question mark, is, of course, as already said by Susie, a kind of a provocation. The work, and I think all of you know that work from which this portrait is taken here, this detail is taken, is certainly the most renowned, or the best known early Netherlandish painting worldwide, I think. And it is certainly very high on top of the charts of paintings most commented on. So maybe with Las Meninas by Velázquez, but it's really at the top of both. And there are, of course, countless articles on this work. There are many monographs on Jan van Eyck, which always, of course, deal in a prominent place with this very work. it also features in a lot of general histories of art, histories of European art. I think more often than not it appears there. And there is a total, as far as I see, of 8 books dedicated to this one painting alone, the painting of which you see a detail here. And the fame of the painting, let's say its title or name, the Arnolfini double portrait or even the Arnolfini marriage, are intricately linked to this man, to the figure, and to his identification. And research on the painting that started more than 100 years ago, about 125 years ago, was always concerned with the question, what is depicted in that work and who is that man that you see here. So a huge amount of literature, as I said. And what is interesting, this painting, and I show you the whole thing now, has always, excuse me, always stimulated fantasy in a most unconventional way, let's say. Unusual flights of fantasy have been ignited by this very work. And it also, for a long time, obviously, or very often in its history, it served as a kind of screen for the projection of ideas and sometimes days. We will turn to that later. And even during the last decades, the last 18, 90 years, let's say, when there was a highly increased production of art historical articles and contributions on early Netherlandish painting in general, and on this very painting in particular, the ideas of the day, of course, always were glad, or always found in, let's say, in a screen again, or something to be fixed to in this very work, starting with Panofsky's early Netherlandish painting book. You all know it well. Disguised symbolism is developed, and of course this work played a crucial role, and later on it served as a kind of document for historical marriage rites, etc. And in younger times it served as a work that embodied, so to say, in which was realized something like unwritten art theory. I do not know if it is so popular, if this idea is so popular in Great Britain, but in Germany it was for a time, had been invented by a certain Rudolf Preimsberger, who found painted art history in many a painting, always following, of course, the concepts of Italian writers and art. And of course, this very painting in London couldn't be spared from that. On the contrary, because it has an element in itself that lends itself to reflection, namely the reflecting object, the mirror. Therefore, I think this is the reason why it is so often commented upon, and why it was so widely discussed in different respects. Something like Las Meninas, where also the mirror figures prominently. And it goes so far, and this is something I mentioned just in passing before I turn to the work itself, that about 20 years ago a book was published by a certain Yvonne Yu, and the book is really it's not bad. I mean, it's really an intelligent book, but the conclusion she reaches is really a little bit strange, because according to her, in this very painting, Jan van Eyck anticipated the ideas of Ferdinand de Saussure by 450 years. So according to her, this painting is about the relationship between signifiant and signifié, so signifier and signified probably are the English terms. Well, it's very cleverly built up, that book, but nevertheless I do not believe a word of it. And without flattering, I can say there is one rough and extensive article that stands out, and that is the basis for each and every research on the work, and for my research, and I guess too, and that is a catalogue entry by Lord Campbell of the 1998 catalogue of the early Netherlandish school in the National Gallery, London. And I will come back to that very article from time to time, and as I said, I used it as a starting point. It's most useful, and it's no doubt the most sensible contribution to this work so far. However, in the end, I will try in some points to contradict that article. That's why I'm here. It will be useful, of course. Despite all the effort that has been made, and despite tons of literature and so much research on the individual objects, and there are many, of course, the stately bed, a bench, patterns and shoes, oranges on the shelf and on the sideboard, the mirror, the chandelier, everything, and all that in the chamber of a brick house. As you can see, all that had been interpreted, and there has been much research done on the assumed man who commissioned the painting, the one who's portrayed here, who's almost always taken to be a member of the Lucchese family, Arnolfini, who had several members working in Bruges, working and living in Bruges in Flanders. And much has been done, archival research, both in Bruges and in Lucca. However, all these efforts did not yield anything that would corroborate the identification of this man with an Arnolfini. This identification, suggested 160 years ago, rests on just two little entries in inventories from the first half of the 16th century. And we will turn to that in a moment. Before, I would like to show you this little painting. It's shown here at the same scale. It's in Berlin, it's a Gemäldegalerie, and it's obviously the same man. However, the Berlin portrait, unfortunately, we had it cleaned and restored last year, and well, in a way, I was hoping that something might be turned up, maybe that something was hidden under overpainting. The black background was partially overpainted, and when the overpainting was removed, there was just a black background. And on the back side, there's again nothing but some scratches, etc. So it does not help at all. What we can see, of course, it is the very same man. I'm pretty sure it is one and the same person, despite the fact, of course, that there are some differences in the chin and the cheekbones. And if you look very closely, you find here and there a difference. But then, I mean, these are, of course, not photos. They are handmade. So, however, in any event, this is a remarkable and, as far as I know, unique case of the portrait of one and the same person made by one and the same painter in the 15th century. So in all early Netherlandish painting, there is not a second instance where one painter painted the same patron two times, except for in altarpieces. I'm talking about autonomous portrait panels. So maybe there is an example that I didn't find or forgot. I do not know. Maybe Susan, you know it. No one, but I couldn't find one. So now the name Arnolfini, it has been mentioned very often. That comes from the inventory of Margaret of Austria. And Margaret of Austria, probably all of you know, was a very important woman in the first half of the 16th century. She was a natural daughter of Maximilian of Austria, the later emperor, and Mary of Burgundy, daughter of Charles the Bold. And in the 16th century, she became the regent of the Low Countries and resided in Mechelen, or Mechelen. And this is what we have as written evidence. On the painting it's written Johannes de Eyck fuit hic, 1434, so Johannes de Eyck has been here. And in two inventories of Margaret from 1516 and 24, the male figure in the portrait is called Arnulfin and Arnulfin. And this is the first inventory drawn up in July 1516 at Mechelen in the palace of Margaret of Austria and in the presence of the region. And unfortunately, I could only find this fragmentary photo, but it's the first line that is interesting here, and this is the first line. Un grand inserted tableau qu'on appelle Arnulfin. And in English, the text reads, a large picture which is called Arnulfin with his wife in a chamber, which was given to Madame by Don Diego, whose arms are in the cover of the said picture, done by the painter Johannes. And then it is added in the margin, it is necessary to put on a lock to close it, which Madame has ordered to be done. First inventory. Second inventory, now I have this facsimile, it's not so easy to read. This is the French text, and in translation it reads, Item, another very exquisite picture, which closes with two shutters, where there are painted a man and a woman standing, touching hands, done by the hand of Johannes. The arms and device of the late Don Diego on the said two shutters, the name of the person being Arnulfin. After the death, so we now know this Don Diego. Don Diego was the first known owner of the portrait, and he had given it to Margaret of Austria, probably around 1550. After Margaret's death in 1530, the painting passed to the collection of her niece Mary of Hungary, who in the mid-1450s went to Spain and took the painting, as many other belongings, with her. And after her death in 1557, this inventory was drawn up in Simancas, that is in Spain. It reads, a large panel with two doors with which it closes, and in it a man and a woman who take each other's hands, with a mirror in which the said man and woman are shown, and on the doors the arms of Diego de Guevara, done by Johannes de Eyck in the year 1434. So this time they had obviously read the inscription on the painting, although the name Johannes de Eyck is not really correct given the inscription of the painting, but it is clear who is meant. And from this document we also learn who this Don Diego that was mentioned in Margaret of Austria's inventory was. It was Diego de Guevara, and this is probably Diego de Guevara. Actually, it is not really sure. I should have placed a question mark there too. A painting by Michel Zito showing Diego. And Diego de Guevara was a Spanish nobleman who had been brought up in the Low Countries in the circle of Charles the Bold, and who later became a close acquaintance and advisor to the Habsburg rulers. And he was a good friend with Maximilian, Philip the Fair, and Margaret of Austria. And the coat of arms, of which there was sometimes mention, the arms and the device of Diego are these. from a Russell confraternities register made in 1520, the year of Diego's death, and this is his coat of arms, and this is his device, hors du compte, and that means something like out of a tale or so, or from a tale. I do not know what the right translation might be, so something like out of a tale, a fairy tale or so. And what you see there, the red thing, that's a cross of Calatrava, because Don Diego was a Calatrava knight. That is a very high-ranking Spanish order, and he was only admitted to that order in 1517. So when he gave the painting with his coat of arms to Margaret, the Calatrava cross could not have been there. And what would it have looked like? So there are two possibilities. One is this, of course. It's a little reconstruction I made. And so this is supposed to be the closed triptych with its shutters closed. So on the outside, here is the opening in the middle. Could have been placed the motto, the device and coat of arms of Diego, or the other possibilities, of course, here another little self-made thing. It could have been the coat of arms could have been on the inside of those wings, which are mentioned several times. Personally, I like the first variant better, but who knows, we cannot tell. And of course, both these variations existed with portraits, and what I show you here is one portrait by Albrecht Dürer, Oswald Krell, dated 1499, and the other one is by Rogier van der Weyden, Philippe de Croix. This is coat of arms. In the Krell case, we have to be cautious, however, because this triptych form is a modern reconstruction. I only learned that recently, and it might be that it was originally a diptych with Krell and his wife, and that the two white men with the coat of arms formed a kind of shutter to it, so it might not have been a triptych. Here in this case, de Croix's coat of arms is on the back side of the panel, and that makes sense because it was a right-hand side wing of a diptych, and so when the diptych would have been closed, the coat of arms of de Croix would have been visible. And in both these instances, and every other instance I know, when there is a coat of arms next to a portrait or on the backside of a portrait, it is indeed the coat of arms of the sitter that is represented, and thus, and therefore, Alexandre Panchard, who in 1856 published the inventories of Mary of Hungary. Here, it's a text you have already seen. Alexandre Panchard at the time concluded that this triptych in Mary's showed Diego de Guevara and his wife, of course. And of course, Panchard, who knew about the Diego de Guevara who died in 1520, and of course he couldn't be represented in a painting from 1434, but he quite consequently thought that the other members of the Guevara family might have been already in the Netherlands, in the Low Countries already in the early 15th century, and so that this Diego de Guevara and his wife in Mary of Hungary's inventory might have been, for example, the grandfather of the later Diego. Panchard did not know at the time the inventories of Margaret of Austria. And I dare to say, if these inventories of Margaret would not be known to us today, I'm pretty sure that the painting in question, the painting here in London, would be very famous as a portrait of Diego de Guevara Sr. and his wife. Definitely, because that would only be natural. So, Panchard did not know the Margaret of Austria inventory, and he did not know the original painting. But around the same time, shortly before, the original painting made its appearance in the art world. And that the reason was, after the death of Mary of Hungary in Spain, the painting was inherited by Philip II of Spain, and then by the successor of Philip, and so on, so that it remained and stayed in the royal collections of Spain until the early 19th century. And then it was looted during the Napoleonic War, in the Peninsular War, by somebody from Wellington's troops. And probably it was a certain, I don't know, was it a colonel, sergeant, whatever, James Hay was his name, an officer from Wellington's army, and he probably got in its possession there in Spain during the campaign, and he took it to London. And at first, around 1820, Hayes wanted to sell the painting to the National Gallery or to other persons, and Lord Campbell has described this in detail, what happened, but there wasn't much interest. But 20 years later, when Hayes again tried to sell the painting, the appreciation, let's say, of early Flemish painting had completely changed. For around 1840, there was suddenly a lively interest in Northern primitive painting, what we today call Northern Renaissance. And thus the National Gallery finally bought the painting in 1843, and obviously it made a strong impact, because what you see here is an illustration from the Illustrated London News from the year 1843, and it was reproduced there, which means, of course, a certain public interest must even have been aroused by it. And well, the copyist obviously had to struggle with proportions, and I must say he proved not really to be able to reproduce the faces, and she really looks a little bit like Queen Victoria in her later days, so it's an anticipation of Victorian age, clearly. And what's interesting also, I do not know if you can read it from here is the inscription on the painting also. It is said, Johannes de Eyck fecit hic. So it's a misreading. On the painting is written fugit, from esse, to be. And here, fecit, from facere, do, to do. So Jan van Eyck made this, or has made this. That's interesting, because I think it determined certain interpretations that would be issued soon afterwards. In the National Gallery, it was for a time seen, or the broader public saw it, as a kind of genre painting. And I said at the beginning that this painting very often served as a kind of projection surface for ideas and obsessions of the day. And this is definitely true in the 1840s and 50s, when I think by those who read the inscription as Jan van Eyck fecit hic, Jan van Eyck has done this. They assumed that this was a genre painting, and of course a genre painting that was completely in line with Victorian obsessions, because it's a pregnant woman, it's a fallen woman, of course, and she's accepted again, or maybe somebody else took her by a man, and obviously he is doing an admonition to her, which she deserves, of course. Yeah, and that is what Victorians thought about the work. And I remember a couple of years ago having seen, I think, somewhere in Liverpool also, a series of Victorian paintings showing exactly that, a woman who has an adulterous relationship and is caught and then thrown out, and everything ends in misery and pain. And that was the idea of the time. But then there were some other scholars who had read the inscription properly. Jan van Eyck has been here, and they recognized Jan van Eyck himself in the male figure. And that was the case with Charles Eastlake, then the director of the National Gallery, Gustav Friedrich Wagen, a museumman from Berlin who was traveling the UK and Kunstschätze in England, and John Ruskin. And they saw this as a portrait of Jan van Eyck himself with his wife. So far, so good. And then, in the year 1857, Arnolfini stepped onto the stage. And this was due to Joseph Arthur Crow and Giovanni Battista Cavacaselle, who wrote a groundbreaking monography and published it in 1857, and it was the first scholarly book on early Netherlandish painting, and it's called The Early Flemish Painters. So it's really still worth reading that book. There's so much insight in it, and it's astonishing what they already knew and what they discerned, etc. at that early point. I mean, there were virtually no photographies of the works available, etc. It's all from memory. It's a remarkable book. And they also had a remarkable knowledge of written sources, for they knew both the already published inventories of Margaret of Austria, as well as a number of documents from Bruges, where the name of a silk merchant, what's the name? Arnolfini, was mentioned. And they concluded that the painting listed in the inventories of Margaret of Austria, the inventories that you have seen at the beginning, and that mention Arnulfin and Arnulfin, that the painting in the inventory was a portrait of a man called Arnolfini, of a member of that Arnolfini family in Bruges. And their idea was, of course, that the one who wrote down the inventory misunderstood a little bit the name Arnulfin. And if you pronounce it in French, Arnulfin, Arnulfin, well, that is extremely similar, one must really say. So it definitely was a very good possibility. However, contrary to what you can find in many an article on this work, and quite often in the literature, Crow and Cavacaselle did not identify this work in the National Gallery with the one described in Margaret of Austria's inventory. They, on the contrary, they found it much more plausible that we are dealing with two works, one preserved and in London, and the other one formerly in Margaret's collection and now lost. And one of the reasons why they did not think that this was a work from Margaret's collection is, and I have highlighted it here in blue, because they said it has been supposed, however, and with some appearance of probability, that the figures in the National Gallery are the portraits of John van Eyck and his wife. And then they continue the likeness between her here and a portrait of Jan's wife Margarete from 1439 in Bruges is so striking that it bears out this identification. That is what Crow and Cavacaselle thought. So the idea that this is Jan van Eyck and his wife was extremely strong at the time. However, that would change soon afterwards, namely in 1861, when James Weale wrote one can really say also groundbreaking and fundamental article on Van Eyck, where he dealt with this painting, and he, let's say, paved the way for almost all following investigations of that work to the present day. For James Weale, he knew the inventories of Margaret of Austria, but he likewise knew the inventory of Mary of Hungary, and that had been unknown to Proudhon Cavacazel. And in the inventory of Mary of Hungary, it was explicitly said that the painting in question is dated 1434, and that is exactly the date here on the painting. And from that, Weale concluded it is one and the same painting that was in the possession of Margaret of Austria, passed to her niece Mary of Hungary, and finally ended up in the National Gallery, London. And he also took over from Proudhon Cavacazel the identification of Arnolfin with Arnolfini, Arnolfin. And one of his reasons was, for one part, he did of work in Bruges archives, and he was obviously very proud that he had found so many mentions of Arnolfinis there. Of course, that's always a convincing argument. If you can connect the name to a lot of documents, you are inclined to accept the name as the correct one. But he had other reasons too, and one was that the man in our portrait has not the slightest resemblance to this young man, and that is one of the just judges on one wing of the Ghent Altarpiece. And this very figure was believed, at least since the 16th century, to be a portrait of Jan van Eyck. And in the 19th century, that was generally accepted as a portrait of Jan van Eyck. That's no longer so today. Today, nobody really believes that this is really a likeness of Jan van Eyck. But of course, for Weale, it was an argument. Couldn't be Jan van Eyck, therefore Arnolfini. Now he was facing a difficulty. When he eliminated Jan van Eyck as the one who was shown in the portrait, he had the difficulty how to explain the inscription. Because what you see is a chamber, a room where these two people are standing, and seemingly on the wall and at the same time on the surface, of course, of the panel, it is written, Johannes de Eyck has been here, 1434. So, has been here in this room, but it's not that man. Well, big problem, where's Jan van Eyck? But Weale had an ingenious solution for that. Because he said, Jan van Eyck has been there, but not in the room, but only on the threshold. He's there, in the mirror. Realized that there are two people reflected in the mirror, and I hope that you can see them both. One is dressed in blue and the other one in red, standing behind the blue one, and there might even be more, but there is darkness, you cannot see it. So they are standing in front of a door that leads into the chamber, and they are obviously at this very moment greeted by the man. And so the reasoning of Weale was Jan van Eyck had placed his easel right on the doorstep to that room, so it must have been very uncomfortable to sit there on the threshold with his easel when he made a realistic and completely reliable portrait of the interior. So the idea was, obviously, again, completely 19th century, Jan van Eyck would have sat there in the door and would have painted exactly what was to be seen there in the nice apartment of the Arnolfini couple. Of course, we see that differently today, and it has been more than one time pointed out that this is, of course, not a handmade photo of real existing interiors, but it's hard to say what is realistic, what is not, but it's clearly an arrangement. However, with Weale's idea that Jan van Eyck is this man, the foremost, of course, otherwise the view would have been blocked into the room, he researchers, so it had a huge success because almost every following discussion of the work almost accepted this. Jan van Eyck is there in the mirror. And starting from that observation, a lot of other theories arose. And the most well-known, the best-known one, the most famous one, and the most crazy, I must say, is that by Erwin Panofsky. And he wrote in 1934, that was exactly 500 years after the painting was created. And his starting point was a little anecdote that was written down by Marcus van Farnewijk, that had been a scholar a humanist or something in Ghent. And he wrote down that Farnewijk in 1568 that Mary of Hungary once owned a very small painting by Jan van Eyck, in which a man and a woman were married by fides, and that Mary had the painting, acquired the painting from a barber, and gave him 100 guilders or so pension in return. And it is very clear that some crucial elements of the story are not correct. I mean, it is not a very small painting. In the inventories, it is even described as large. And Mary did not buy it from a barber, but instead inherited from Margaret of Austria. And so there should be not so much reason to believe the rest of the story, namely the marriage by fides, but Panofsky did. And he developed the idea that Marcus van Farnewijk, who couldn't have seen the original because it was long in Spain, that he had a letter from Spain describing the work, strange enough, obviously, as a very small work, and that he mistranslated portions of that letter, and that the couple was married by fides in reality meant something else, that there was another term. And Panofsky introduced the term fides levata, and this is this. Fides levata. Levata, raised. Fides is an oath, also fidelity oath. And he said, so it is fides levata. So with his hand, the man declares that he will be the husband of this lady. So this is the marriage with fides levata as the appropriate gesture. It has been found out much later that the term fides levata was invented by Panofsky. It's really true, it does not exist. In fact, that was found out in the 1980s already. And I think it's absolutely appropriate for that, for this very panel and the many theories around it, that the most influential essay on it starts with pure invention. And this is what would continue in research of the painting. So it was Panofsky's idea, the marriage, and then why this inscription and why the two men there, and there Panofsky had an idea that so many people believed until recently, which is very strange, as the idea is completely nonsensical. He said, so Jan van Eyck and another man, they were the witnesses at the wedding. And Jan van Eyck wrote here his witness statement. And this is a painted marriage contract. So what you would do somewhere at the authority, for example, signing as a witness, if two people got married, that is what Jan van Eyck did here on the panel, and to make sure that he really was there, to give more credibility to the fact he had shown himself indistinguishably in the mirror. And this is, I mean, it's such a strange idea. You know, there are two indistinct figures with no features at all, and to say, oh, this means we are the witnesses. And then there were two, and where's the name of the other witness? It's a little bit strange. And then it has been pointed out only decades later that both in medieval times as today, each and every contract should bear the date of a certain, just the year. And this applies also to a marriage that takes place on a certain day and not only in a certain year. So the whole thing is, of course, complete nonsense. But it was, as I said, quite successful, and then it was developed further, and somebody remarked that the man is giving his left hand, which is rather natural. If you are standing next to another person and you're holding hands, one has to give his left hand, but all right. So Peter Schabacker suggested that this was a left-handed marriage, a so-called morganatic marriage, and that morganatic theory, I saw it recently, that it popped up again in an article published 2 years ago. And morganatic, you might not be familiar with that word. Morganatic means in families of the highest, actually, aristocracy. If one member of such a high aristocratic family marries somebody of a lower rank, then it's called morganatic. It's also what is called in French mésalliance. One wonders how a bourgeois merchant could have had a morganatic marriage. I mean, yeah, this is a lover, yes, but morganatic marriage, that's really another nonsense. And later, the painting became a betrothal. That was the idea of Edwin Hall, that gained some reputation until somebody pointed out that a woman with such a hood normally is already married. And all that nonsense, all these theories, and there are far more, several more, and they are very highly developed, and every object in the room becomes a symbol of marriage, of betrothal, of whatever. They were all, I think, in a way, eliminated by Lord Campbell, who applied Occam's razor and cuts them off in a way, saying that the work in question is a portrait of a married couple, greeting some others who come into the room. Nothing marriage, nothing betrothal. However, Lord Campbell kept the idea that Jan van Eyck is seen in the mirror. But who were these two people, even if we accept the Arnolfini identification? Already in the 19th century, it was assumed that it's Giovanni di Arrigo Arnolfini, as Giovanni he was always called, who had as his wife Giovanna Cenami. And that was repeated time and again until 1997. And in that year, Jacques Paviot published an article in which he showed that this couple was only married in 1447, that is 13 years after the painting was made. So Giovanna Cenami is out. However, some other scholars tried to rescue Giovanni di Arrigo, and it has been proposed that this Giovanni was married to another woman before. So another woman we do not know the name of, and he was married to her in 34, and then she died, and he married again in 47. But that is obviously a pure invention. There's absolutely not the slightest hint to something like that. So goodbye, Giovanni d'Arrigo. And in this really very thorough research, Lord Campbell found one other candidate in the Arnolfini family, and unfortunately that man is also called Giovanni. And there seems to have been a certain shortage of male names in the Arnolfini family because they were almost all called Giovanni. Therefore it's a little bit difficult, and Lorne first spoke of another Giovanni, but recently Jan Verheyen, a scholar from the Netherlands, dug again into archives, and he found out that this second Giovanni, who might have been represented here, was in fact always called Giannino oder Gino. Giannino, and this Giannino had a wife, Costanza Trenta, as long found out, and he found also out, unfortunately, that Costanza Trenta was dead by 1433, and that is 1 year before the painting was made. So just two escape routes if you like to keep Arnolfini there. That is assuming that Giovanni Giannino married again very soon after the death of Costanza, which is in no way corroborated by documents. I mean, this Giannino appears several times in Jewish documents, but there is never question of a wife or children. Or the second suggestion made by Mac Costa about 20 years ago is that the wife is dead. And you would say, of course she is dead, as is a man. And all that, that's highly likely. No, but Mac Costa's idea was, in this portrait, the woman is dead, but the man is alive. And this is really a very, very, very strange idea. Imagine the man greeting the visitors on the doorstep. Hello, may I introduce you to my dead wife? Yeah, really, I mean, this is what you would have to believe. And then Mac Costa compared this painting to works like this one. I picked that because you have these nice corpses here, and this is front and back side of a panel from Swabia from around 1470 or so, and she says, so a dead wife and a dead woman and a living man, it's something similar to that, and I must say, this is really crazy, what a complete misunderstanding of images becomes visible here, because this is, in the first place, not a portrait. And then this is, of course, a contrast of youth, spring, love, with age, death, and decay. And this is a memento mori. And of course, it's not here that the woman is dead and the man is alive, or the other way around. So it's a complete nonsense, I must say. And she further mentioned or showed in images some tomb sculptures where you can see couples on their tomb plates holding hands. But she doesn't go so far to suggest that this was a tomb plate, which it was certainly not. So again, it is really a nonsense, but that very idea that gained some acceptance, and I just found it recently in an article just 2 years old, where somebody wrote the portrait of the couple in which we see how the deceased and the mourner hold hands in an Eyckian constructed reality, woken to eternal life by the artist who left his signature behind on the wall of his friend's room. And I think Jan van Eyck was all the time crying when he painted the work. Look for salt on the painted surface. No, I mean, this is a description of a 19th century painting, of course. It's absolute nonsense. And what is neglected with this approach to assume a dead woman is, of course, the extremely and exceptional narrative structure of this work. I mean, this is the usual way that Eyckian portraits look like, and other portraits of the period. And this is really so genre-like and resembles genre paintings or the predecessors of genre paintings, like this work by Petrus Christus from 1449, which is, of course, informed by the Eyckian work, which shows the patron saint of goldsmiths, probably at least St. Eligius, with two customers, and these are not portraits. This is really a proto-genre painting, and it has a very similar the painting in London has a very similar narrative quality to it. So, and that narrative quality was already seen in earlier centuries. So I said, I've mentioned that the work passed from Mary of Hungary to the royal collections, and there are other descriptions of it, and one here from 1499 by a certain Jakob Quelvis that reads in German, in English, sorry. It's German, that Quelvis, but he wrote in Spanish. An image where a young man and a young woman holding hands as if they are promising future marriage. There is much writing and all of this. And then comes a verse from Ovid, Ars Amatoria, see that you promise, what harm is there in promises? In promises, anybody can be rich. It's, of course, a sarcastic advice to the lover, not to make precious gifts, but simply to promise if he wants to lure a young woman into his bed. That's one inventory, and the other one, drawn up around 1700, translation is a picture on panel with two doors that close with its wooden frame gilded with unburnished gold. Some verses from Ovid written on the frame of the picture, which is of a pregnant German woman dressed in green, giving her hand to a youth, and it appears that they are getting married by night, and the verses declare how they are deceiving each other. And the doors are of wood painted with marbling, valued at 60 doubloons. And so it is very clear what people saw in the painting in the 16th century. A man who lifts his hand as if promising marriage, so he seems to be very solemn, and his real aim is to get the young lady into the bed that's already prepared, and the young woman at the same time is presenting herself as an innocent girl, and what the man does not realize is that she's already pregnant by a different man. So they are deceiving each other. And that is clearly what was seen in the painting, a moralizing genre painting. That was the idea people had in the 16th century. And it's again due to Lon Campbell to have recognized that there was a fundamental change in the perception of the painting, that it was originally, of course, conceived as a portrait, but later on was seen as a moralizing genre painting. That is essential, absolutely essential. However, the question is, in my eyes, when did this change occur? When was the painting no longer seen as a portrait, but as a kind of genre painting? And in this respect, I would like to return to Margaret of Austria's first inventory. What is said there is that the painting had been personalized by Diego de Guevara when he added his device and arms. So, one of my reconstructions. And there's just one other painting in her collection that comprises around 90 paintings or so, that was personalized. Personalized not by the figure depicted in a portrait, but by someone else. And this is this entry, here you can read, un tableau de bonne peinture d'une belle fille esclave. So, a panel in good painting of a beautiful slave girl. And sur la couverte, on the lid of it, are Charles Ourson, the steward of Madame, and his father, and also the dog of Madame, whose name is Bonté. So, he s'appelle Bonté. So, Charles Ourson had personalized this object, which he had given to Margaret, certainly to flatter her with her little dog, Bonté. And maybe Charles Ourson had no coat of arms or device or whatever, but he had shown himself and his father, who might
already have been in the service of Madame, and he gave a painting. And that painting was definitely not seen as a portrait. I do not know what une belle fille esclave, a beautiful slave girl, might be, but it is a kind of genre. Maybe it has something to do with the Schiavoni, these North Italian painters. Maybe it was something Italian, but it was not seen as a portrait. And this is, in my eyes, this is my first important point. Finally, I come to it. I think it is absolutely inconceivable that Diego de Guevara, of the highest level of aristocracy, would have put his coat of arms on the protecting shutters of the portrait of a merchant. Imagine that he would give it to Margaret of Austria, and he would say, here, this wonderful painting by Van Eyck with my coat of arms, and if you open it up, there's the merchant Arnolfini. This is really unthinkable. This can be, I think this can completely be excluded, especially as there is a hierarchy between the wings and the inside of a triptych. The wings are always for protective use, and if there are the coat of arms of Diego de Guevara and there would have been a virgin at the center, or maybe the emperor, that is all right, but not the merchant Arnolfini. Therefore, I think this point alone shows that Diego de Guevara couldn't have been aware or couldn't have been thought that this was somebody, a merchant called Arnolfini, and that he would have told that to Margaret of Austria. However, it is possible to personalize genre paintings, and I show you these two examples. Here, for example, by Cranach with a coat of arms, of somebody who had commissioned it, and of course the man who had commissioned it has certainly not himself portrayed as this drunkard in a brothel. It's a brothel scene. And here this is an ideal courtly love couple with some flirting texts, and this is not a portrait. And there is the coat of arms of the Münzenberg family, lower nobility, who owned that work. And I think the very same is true of the Eyckian panel. And now I come to my second point, and that is the textual comparison. The first inventory of Margaret of 1516. If you look at the context, she had many portraits. Almost all the paintings in her collection, about 80 or so, were portraits. And this is a representative choice of some of the descriptions, and you would see un autre tableau de la face d'une Portugaloise, un petit tableau du chiffre de la Rouen, Don Isabel, Spanish Queen, un autre tableau de Madame Isabelle de Portugal, un autre tableau du chiffre de Duc Bleu de Brabant, etc., even un petit tableau de la portraiture du Grand Turc. So they were all described in a definitely different from this un grand tableau qu'on appelle un Arnolfin. And the same is true of the second inventory. Here, again, portraits. Most of them are called portraits. And la portraiture de Madame, portraiture. And then here is an autre tableau for exquis und so weiter, où il y a peint un homme et une femme, nommé le personnage Arnolfin. So I think there is a very clear distinction between, in both inventories, which were drawn up by different clerks, in both inventories, a very clear distinction between portraits and our painting. And if you look at it, here, the 1516 inventory, it is called un grand tableau qu'on appelle. It is not even said un tableau, un homme qui s'appelle Arnolfin, but un tableau qu'on appelle. And even the little dog of Madame Bonté is characterized in a different way, and Bonté probably was not able to speak, but it is said qui s'appelle, and here it is qu'on appelle. So this is much more impersonal. And then there is another entry with qui s'appelle, and I always thought, I must say, that here an autre tableau, qui s'appelle l'infante de fortune, the child of fortune. And I always thought, okay, this is a kind of a genre piece too, but Lon Campbell told me rightly that Infante de Fortuna was indeed a person, Enrique de Aragon y Pimentel, and he was always called Infante de Fortuna, and this is, Infante de Fortuna is sobriquet, of course. However, again, it's qui s'appelle, not qu'on appelle, and then one must say Infante de Fortuna is likewise not the name of the person. There is not written qui s'appelle Enrique de Aragon, but qui s'appelle Infante de Fortune. That means the one who wrote this entry was aware of the fact that Infante de Fortuna, whatever it might mean to him, is not, of course, not the name of the person. And now if we look at these two entries with the same formulation from 1523-24, you have here the description of our London portrait, nommé le personnage Arnolfini, and there is another panel described, an autre tableau d'une jeune dame accoutée à la mode de Portugal, so a young lady dressed in Portuguese fashion, and then comes nommée la belle portugaloise. And this is very much the same formulation, the same inventory. And of course, that lady was not called Belle Portugaloise. Belle was not her first name. Belle Portugaloise is the title, so to say, of the work. It's something like La Belle Jardinière or The Blue Boy. You all know The Blue Boy in Gainsborough. And of course, that boy in the painting is not called Blue, but it's a title of the work. And I think it is here absolutely the same. That is not meant to name the real Christian name of the person, but it is something like the title of the work. And therefore, I think this transformation from a portrait to a piece of genre took already place when the work was in the possession, or before the work was in the possession of Diego de Guevara. And of course we know he must have added his coat of arms to it, and I also think that he is the most likely candidate for the addition of the wings, because there are extremely few portraits in the shape or the format of a triptych. So portraits with wings, it almost nowhere occurs. There are just two examples now. Both these examples are from around 1500. Well, and I think Diego de Guevara is the most likely person to have added not only his coat of arms, but the wings. And of course, the lines by Ovid. And maybe it is not by pure chance that Margaret of Austria in the first inventory of 1516 ordered that a lock should be placed on the wings to close them. So why? I mean, the painting was in her private rooms. I mean, this was not a measurement to prevent it from being stolen. Of course not. But what she wanted was to restrict or to limit access to the painting, to the scene. And I can very well imagine that she did this because the scene was interpreted as slippery or suggestive, let's say, and maybe that young women shouldn't see it. And I think it was much the same, and the reason why this, nobody understood it, and therefore it was seen as something, narrative, a genre painting of a suggestive type. And I think this is now the reason for this Arnul, who came up in her inventory, because as an Italian colleague, Marco Paoli, found out in 2020, or he discovered that, let's say it was well known to Romanists already. Arnoul was in French folk literature the name for the cuckold. And that was a character, a role. And you see here these, even in the Roman de la Rose of the 13th century, it said, by your lust, I have become a member of the Brotherhood of Saint in Arnoul, Lord of the Cuckolds. And here in this 15th century story, it said just a man married a woman, and the very same day he was admitted to the guild or to the Brotherhood of Saint Arnoul, for he had 14 children in his marriage without making one of them himself. So, and there are countless of these examples, and that reaches down until Molière. It even appears in Molière, and it's very well known to researchers of French folk literature. So Arnoul, and even the adjective fin, le fin means clever, or shrewd, the shrewd Arnold. Clever Arnold is of course ironic, and that appears in some of these texts, that the cuckold is so clever, so clever that he does not realize that his wife is betraying him. And I think this is exactly what was thought of this painting, especially as the figures had this rather old-fashioned dress, which was certainly seen as something more or less comic in the 16th century. And then there was a bed, which is a furniture, representative furniture in the 15th century, but in the 16th century, of course, was seen as what it is, a place to lie in. And I think, therefore, it has quite a lot in common with representations like this. Lucas van Leyden, 1507, exactly the time. So you have this couple in slightly exaggerated 15th century clothes. It's all an exaggeration, and of course they are not meant to be a portrait. And then a bit vicious even, of course, in this nice couple of pseudo-portraits, which have been shown recently by Emma Capron at the National Gallery. And again, in both these works, here not very clear, but here indeed very explicit and very vicious. We have this obscene and sexual note in it that fits very well with the Arnulf idea. And then there's another interesting work. It's this one by Jan Sanders van Hemessen. It's a brothel scene. And if we look at this man in comparison, I must say it is much the same face and almost the same head. And it's interesting that Jan Sanders van Hemessen, who painted that, had access to the court of Margaret of Austria in Mechelen. He obviously went there, and I can imagine that he had seen this painting and used it for his brothel scene. And of course, comes, I have to hurry, I see. The mirror, always assumed to be the place where Johannes de Eyck fooled Hick inside the mirror. However, if we look at a almost contemporary instance, and that's what I place on the annunciation of this lecture. This is from the Weale altarpiece painted in 1438, just 4 years later, by somebody who had a very intimate and close knowledge of the Eyckian portrait and probably of Jan van Eyck and the workshop itself. And what you see there, it is painted for a Franciscan, Heinrich von Weale, and was certainly placed in the Franciscan convent at Cologne. And what do we see in the mirror? 2 Franciscans. And this is not the painter, but it's the beholder, it's us. So the painting was in a convent where there were Franciscans and hardly anybody else. And when they would have looked at the painting, they would have seen themselves. And I think absolutely the same is true for this work. It is us, the visitors, standing in front of the painting, and we are meant to be completely astonished that we can see ourselves in the painting. And a similar idea had still Petrus Christus, here St. Eligius, and there are 2 customers standing in front of his shop, And of course, this is not the painter and his assistant. It is, well, people on the street, so to say, us. Those who are not in the painting. And this leads me to something. Johannes de Eyck has been here. Actually, I think it can, if this is written on the painting and Jan van Eyck is not on the mirror, there's only one candidate for Jan van Eyck. And if you look at something like this here, Dürer, Oswald Krell, nobody ever suggested that the painter of this work is Oswald Krell. Everybody was always convinced, well, it's a sitter, and the same is true for this medallion, where the name of Jean Fouquet is written. Nobody ever said, oh, this was a patron of Fouquet or an unknown saint. No, it is clear, and there's absolutely no contradiction. This is Fouquet himself. And then if we look at inscription on walls, there's one here and there's one there. In this portrait, Georg Giese of 1532, almost 100 years later, by Hans Holbein the Younger. And what we see here, nulla sine mirore voluptas Georg Giese. So that's the device of Giese written on the wall. And in Dürer's self-portrait in Madrid, there's also something written on the wall. And it reads 1498. This I painted after my likeness Albrecht Dürer when I was 26 years old. So it is again referring to the main figure and not to somebody else outside the work. Therefore, I think that's a good old idea from the 19th century that it is Jan van Eyck and his wife is the most likely, and it has often been said they are very similar to each other, while others disagree. They are completely different. I would say they are really, they look very similar. However, I would not count on that alone because especially female portraits of the time were often highly idealized. However, Margaret's Eyck's wife, Jan van Eyck's wife, was called Margaret, and there is, maybe not by chance, a figure of St. Margaret behind her. And then one would think, well, why should the painter show himself and his wife and not himself alone? However, among early self-portraits by artists, by painters, there is an astonishing number of portraits showing the artist and his wife. And you have here the Master of Frankfurt, it's from 1496 or so. Oh, by the way, this is the only of two examples of a portrait with wings. There were wings formally attached to it, but it's rather small. But that's the artist and his wife, and this is engraver Israel von Meckenem with his wife Ida. And here, this is Jacob Cornelis painting the likeness of his wife. This is not a self-portrait, it was made by Dirk Jacobson, the son of the two. And this is a portrait by Laux Pfotenagel, but obviously a copy after an original showing Hans Burgmeier and his wife Anna Allerlei. So again, a portrait of the artist with his wife. So, and I think this man here is the most important obstacle and reason why this one is not accepted as a likeness of Van Eyck, because people tend to like this man and to dislike that. And Jakob Burckhardt already said in 1885, das völlig blutleere Gesicht eines Abkömmlings einer völlig großstädtisch verlebten Familie, that is something, the completely bloodless face of a scion of a completely spent urban family. And then Martin Conway, the sharp man of business, if ever there was one, Jesuitical, mean, sly, and self-satisfied. So he's really the nasty guy, absolutely nasty guy. While this man, in the words of Panofsky, the very character of the man in a red turban, impressionable yet imperturbable, disillusioned yet insatiably curious, agrees with the idea which Jan van Eyck's pictures convey of their maker. And I must say, if I think, for example, of the Pale Virgin or the Virgin in the Church, I'm not so sure if I see disillusion and insatiable curiosity there. So it is a little bit complicated. Huh? And I mean, this whole text by Panofsky is what you would say in the laudatio for a 20th century writer who wrote great prose and is also a very good man. It sounds like that. And I mean, actually, the Conway's description of this man seems to lack a certain objectivity. And I think you can likewise describe the man on the left completely different as an extremely sensitive, observant character and whatever. So, I mean, in the end, it's all Lavater, Johann Caspar Lavater, that Swiss physiognomist, who had the idea that you can read the character of a person from his or her portrait, and this is exactly what is going on here, but I think this is not so reliable. And of course there's the idea, this one looks out of the painting as we would expect for a self-portrait, and this one is not looking out but rather shifting his gaze to the wife. However, if we look at a certain group of self-portraits, some look out of the paintings and others don't. So in the end, so finally I can conclude, I think that it is much more likely that this man is indeed Jan van Eyck himself, who proudly proclaims that he has been there. And by the by, Eyck is of course an adverb saying here, but at the same time it's a demonstrative pronoun. This one, it has been discussed quite often, and people tend to say, no, it cannot be this pronoun here, because that wouldn't be good Latin, but who says that Jan van Eyck spoke good Latin? And then the double meaning of Eyck might be intentional here. So thank you very much.